off. They'll kill him. Then it says, but the disciples did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him. Last time Peter got called Satan, so let's just not say anything here. What do they talk about, though? They still don't get it. What do they talk about? They talk about who is the greatest. 9:34. That's what they're talking about? So Jesus has to educate them again. He has to teach them. He says, if anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. That's what they need to learn this time. And then there's the story if he takes a child and he says you have to become like this little child. Now, I think that the child story had a lot more meaning in that time than in our time. In our culture, children are put up on a pedestal of, oh, they're so pure and innocent and wonderful. You know, let's stay together for the children. Don't show that to that's a bad movie. We can watch that, but let's not show that to children. We have this glorified picture of children. In the ancient world, it was the opposite. If you were a child, you were last in line to get your food at the potluck. Their culture had a great respect for the older you were, the more respect you had, really. And so that's why they were so impressed with Moses and Abraham at the time of Christ, because they were dead, but they were also really old, right? So, I mean, our culture has a little bit of that. I remember we'd have these big family reunions every year for a week, and there was a bunch of cousins, and I was the youngest of all the cousins. So if there was ever one bed shy, guess who was sleeping in a sleeping bag on the floor? That was me. And then fortunately, about 6 years later, my aunt had another kid, and so I wasn't the youngest anymore. And so then I was no longer a low man on totem pole, so to speak. So Jesus takes a child and says, you need to be like this child. Meaning, you need to not be concerned with being great. You need to think of everyone else as more important than you. Okay, so 2 blind healings. I'll be killed. They say we want an earthly king. He has to teach them about that. I'll be killed. We want to be great. He has to teach them about that. And, little side note. If you read... Am I hearing feedback? Okay, sorry. If you read this section of 8:22 through the end of chapter 10, you'll find some stories in there and you'll be like, wait a minute, this seems out of place. This doesn't seem to be about the education. But there are some other stories in there because of this desire for greatness. That's why there's these stories about the Pharisees and the scribes. Because in their culture, they weren't the political great ones, but they were the religious great ones. They were the ones with all the respect. They were the ones that everybody thought was so holy. And Jesus has some teachings about them and against them. Okay, that's also the reason for the story of the rich man. He says, you need to sell everything you have, and then he can't. It's hard for a rich man to get saved. Because in their culture, if you were rich, you were really important. Everybody thought you were great. You've seen Fiddler on the Roof, right? Hopefully you have, so you know what I'm talking about. But the song, If I Were a Rich Man, if you're rich in that culture, you're respected. They think you're smart. All of that concept is in the song, If I Were a Rich Man. And when you're rich, they think you really know. And that's also the reason for the emphasis on children. There's some other stories about children in there. So, you have these two, the first two predictions of his death. We want an earthly king. We want to be great. And then the last one is in 1034. Right after he predicts his death, James and John come up to him and say, grant that we may sit one on your right hand and the other on your left in your glory. At least they're valuing the spiritual over the physical. But what are they really asking for? They're asking for honor. Okay, Jesus, so we're not supposed to want an earthly king. We're not supposed to talk about being great now, but we want honor when we get to heaven, right? No. It's not about your own honor. Jesus has to teach them, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. It's not about your own honor. He says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the end of the education of the disciples. What follows is the other blind healing. That's his final word. Even I, who am the Son of God, who am God incarnate, even I am going to give up my life for many. It's not about me seeking honor. It's not about me becoming a king. It's about me giving up my life. So that's the end of the education of the disciples. And you can see a progression throughout, and we don't get to hear their response to this. It doesn't say whether or not they were like, oh. It doesn't say. But what does it have? It has this blind healing, where a guy is like, oh, all in one step. So you have the three killing. We want an earthly king. I'm going to be killed. We want to be great. I'm going to be killed. We want honor. Each time he teaches them. And then you have a blind healing where a guy, Bartimaeus, perfect. Now what's Mark implying by putting that second blind story there? He's implying that they got it, right? Okay, well let's see. Let's see, did the disciples' education work? I'm going to go through just a few points towards the end of the book, and we'll see if the Jesus education of his disciples worked. First, Jesus takes the three disciples who were the focus of the book of Mark, and he takes them and he spends a whole chapter telling them to watch. He tells a big long story. If your master says, I want you to keep watch, and then he goes away, you better keep watching because you don't know when he's coming back and you don't want him to find you asleep on the job. He spends a big long story about watch. The next chapter, could you not keep watch 1 hour? It's the same three in the garden. In his most difficult night on earth, he takes his three closest friends and says, watch and pray with me. And he goes and prays and he's sweating blood and he comes back and they're asleep. Did the disciples' education work? Peter says, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they all were saying the same thing also. Later that chapter, and they all left him and fled. Did the disciples' education work? They crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. And they crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right hand and the other on his left. What's the only other time that phrase, right hand and left, is used in this book? James and John. Now's your chance to be on his right hand and his left. He's the king. He's doing...